Some time ago, when considering the fortifications and defense lines being built in temporarily occupied Crimea, I decided to consider them in the context of available means of defeat that the Ukrainian liberation forces of the depth of effective fire impact on the occupants in Crimea, in case of their defense. As a result, I got such a layer cake with a 40-kilometer zone of use of barrel artillery, 80-kilometer zone of MLRS, as well as 120 and 150-kilometer zones at the prospect of supplying the means of defeat of appropriate range. I should note in advance that the zones of defeat were specified taking into account the mandatory safety buffer for the means of defeat. At the same time, such a layer cake will be viable only in the case of realization of the scenario under which Snake Island was liberated, but adapted for the territory of Crimea. The scenario of complete isolation of the Crimean Peninsula from the outside world and methodical and systematic annihilation of the occupants. The main task of the Ukrainian side to start the active phase of this scenario is to reach the administrative border of the peninsula. After that, the formation of shock and fire potential will begin to fulfill the tasks of destroying all military facilities and military infrastructure on the peninsula. In fact, the AFU could provide 4 zones of defeat, taking into account the available and prospective means of defeat, and these zones would be quite enough to force the Russian troops to shrink as much as possible in the southern location of the peninsula, denuding or at least weakening the north and center of the peninsula. In turn, an important point was to regain full control over the Sea of Azov and cause damage incomparable to the functioning of the only logistical artery connecting the Russian mainland and the peninsula, the Crimean Bridge. Preservation of ferry communication is possible only for civilian purposes, but in case of its use for providing the peninsula with the forces and means of Russian troops, such ferries should be destroyed at sea or in ports, because during transportation of troops, they can and will hide behind civilians. Thus, the enemy contingent on the peninsula will be isolated, and will suffer daily losses, the restoration of which will be impossible. That is, there will be a daily disadvantage, which will lead after some time to a complete loss of combat effectiveness of enemy units in Crimea. But what has changed recently? Recently, the peninsula has begun to fly in means from which there is no hiding. They can hardly be intercepted by Russian air defense means, and even the southern strip of the peninsula is not safe for the occupants even now. Such opportunities significantly unload the AFU ability to create the most effective zone of defeat in temporarily occupied Crimea. And no matter how many personnel the occupants have concentrated on the peninsula, after fleeing from the mainland south, this number will not matter. After all, in Crimea this mass will be in even worse conditions than on the right bank of the Kherson region before fleeing. This is only one of the scenarios that I see most clearly, but at the same time, on the table in the General Staff of the AFU, there are several such scenarios, and some of them are much more unexpected than this template sketch of a larger scale operation than was on Snake Island or the right bank of the Kherson region.